You're watching France 24. Hello and welcome to the business interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. Will Greece get access to more bailout money? Will markets force Spain into asking for financial help? And will France become more competitive? There are still plenty of question marks as the Eurozone debt crisis rumbles on. My guest today has inside knowledge about what's going on behind closed doors. Lorenzo Bini-Smaghi is a former member of the executive board of the European Central Bank. He's now a visiting scholar at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, and he joins us from Rome in Italy. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
Now, there are a lot of issues on the Eurozone agenda. What, in your mind, is the most pressing out of those issues at the moment? What issues or countries should we be keeping an eye on, if you will?
Well, unfortunately, we have to continue watching at what happens with Greece. Greece has done its own part of the job, so now the task is for the other Eurozone countries to find the money to make sure that Greece can undertake its adjustment effort with 2 more years, as promised.
So if Greece is the most important issue at the moment, we have seen disagreement, though, between the IMF and the Eurozone's finance ministers. They have failed to reach an agreement to pay out the next bailout tranche of some 31 billion euros. Do you think that the IMF and the Eurozone finance ministers will agree in the end, and when?
There is agreement on many issues. The key aspect is the financing part, how to make sure that by 2020 the Greeks can reduce the debt to GDP ratio to 120%, and this requires additional financing, and there are several options. None of these options are politically very palatable, especially for the creditor countries, so they're trying to look what is politically less complicated, but I think the commitment has been made. Now they cannot go back, so by next Monday, I think they have to find a solution.
So do you think that creditor countries like Germany, for instance, they're just going to have to accept a so-called haircut, writing down Greece's debts?
Well, you can reduce the debt without having a haircut, as you say, but maybe by lengthening the maturities, reducing interest rates, providing some swaps. I mean, there are very technicalities without showing a net budget loss in the accounts of Germany and the other countries, which would be a problem because the governments would have to go back to the parliaments, and I'm not sure that the parliaments would like to have to budget additional funds for that.
In your mind, have the Greeks themselves, have they done the job? There's been lots of complaints in the past few years or so that the Greek government has been dragging its feet.
Well, there are 2 parts of the job. One is deciding the measures, and the other is implementing. Now, there have been over the last 2 years 2 problems. One, in the decision making, the Greeks have always waited for the last minute, and this has created a lot of problems for the confidence in the process. And the second problem is that implementation has been very bad. The tax collection system, the administration of properties that have to be sold, and so many other things have not really worked out as expected. The whole administrative structure in Greece has to be rebuilt, and this will require many, many years. I think this government seems to be starting on a new ground, so I think we need to give some confidence that many of the things that they have promised will be delivered.
And do you think it will indeed happen that Greece will get its hands on the next bailout tranche, and if so, when?
I think we are running out of time. So as usual, unfortunately, European countries decide always at the last minute, when the drama is sufficiently big that some parts have to give up. Although I have to say the markets now are discounting an agreement. So fortunately, the last few days, the last mile that has to be walked through might be less dramatic than in the past.
Now, you have said that the Spanish government should ask for aid from the rest of the Eurozone and the ECB. Do you really think it will happen? I mean, Spain has resisted so far, and they've been doing quite a good job in resisting it.
Well, there are two issues here. One is looking at the public sector. And the public sector indeed has been able to finance itself at rates which are high, maybe not unsustainable, but are going to imply high primary surpluses for the government to achieve. The other part is the private sector. And the private sector, we have to ask ourselves, can they afford paying so high interest rates? And I think that's where the problem comes. In the end, it's the private sector which has to pay the taxes for the public sector to be coming back to a sustainable public finances and a sustainable deficit. And if the private sector cannot recover, that's going to be very problematic. And the private sector cannot recover if interest rates are so high. So I think in the end, when the markets will see that the private sector continues to be in a recession, cannot pick up, then it will force Spain to apply to a program.
In the past week, we've seen a lot of posturing ahead of a summit on the European Union's budget. We've also seen these differences over Greece between Eurozone finance ministers and the IMF. Do you think that politicians are doing what they should be doing at this stage? Are they really making progress towards actually resolving the issues at stake here?
Well, I think they are making progress, but it's a bit slow, frankly. One can understand that in a crisis like this one, there are difficult decisions to make. Politicians have to go back to their own parliaments, to their own public opinions. It's the public opinions which are facing this crisis with a lot of anxieties, a lot of fears, not willing to give necessarily more money to the European budget. They don't really see how the European budget is contributing to their own wealth, to their own welfare. So there's a task that the politicians have to bridge in terms of explaining why it's important to have a strong Europe, to have a strong European budget that ultimately will help Europe. I think one of the problems that European politicians are facing and maybe are not delivering as expected is to explain why Europe, why more Europe in this crisis is useful for the people in their own countries.
What does all of this political squabbling mean? Does it mean that the Eurozone crisis is worsening in front of our eyes? Or do you think that the markets, for instance, they've already taken this into account? They've accepted at this stage that this is just the way that Europe works?
I think there's part of that. But part of the way in which Europe works is the fact that Europe acts under the pressure of the markets. So there's a kind of a perverse relationship between the markets and actions which are taken by politicians. When the markets are too calm, the politicians don't act. And if the politicians don't act, sooner or later the problems comes back through the back door or through another crisis. And at that point the markets wake up again and put pressure on the politicians. So it's a bit, as I said, a perverse relationship, which means that, of course, the crisis is not over and it will take some time unless the politicians understand that they have to act earlier rather than later.
We've also seen division within the body that you used to be on, the European Central Bank's board. The head of Germany's Bundesbank, Jens Weidmann, for instance, he said that the ECB is potentially breaking its own rules by pledging to help weaker Eurozone governments. What do you say to that, about those divisions that we have seen on the board of the ECB?
Well, first, let me say that the board of the ECB, the governing council, in the end decides. It's not there are no veto powers. There are no, like maybe in the European Council. So the ECB is an institution which, at the end of the day, comes up with a decision. Now, some people may like it, others don't, but at least it has a decision. And this is why the ECB is so decisive in breaking some of the perverse market dynamics. Now, some people may not like, or I would say some people are afraid that these actions may lead to taking too many risks. And I think the central bank has to take some risks. We are in the middle of the worst financial crisis. And if you compare the ECB with the Fed in the US or the Bank of England, I think the ECB is taking much fewer risks than others. But of course, the risks are there. And this is why when the ECB acts, it needs to see the action by the political authorities. And this is why the intervention by the ECB is conditional on the political authorities doing their own part.
But do you think that Jens Weidmann's disagreement with the rest of the ECB board, is it a problem at this stage, or do you think that we in the media are making too much of it?
I think the disagreement has been there for 2.5 years, and the ECB has acted. So I think it's part of the way in which institutions work. Maybe it was the first time in Europe. I think at the end of the day, the markets have understood, and maybe the media would like to make a bit more noisy around what the ECB is doing. But in the end of the day, the decisions are taken. So I think we have to look at what the president says and the decisions that are taken, not at the noise around these decisions.
All right, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to ask you this finally. Now, the Eurozone is now officially in recession. When do you think that economic growth will actually get off the ground again?
Well, I think it may be longer than many people think. This is a global crisis. It's a crisis of over-indebtedness, and we know that these kind of crises take a long time. So it may be that the recession, in terms of negative output, may end by the middle of next year. But in terms of picking up fast growth, I think it will take longer.
All right, quite a gloomy outlook there. Thanks very much indeed, Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, a former member of the European Central Bank's governing board. Thanks very much indeed once again. And with that, we're also going to wrap up the programme. Thanks for watching France 24, and do stay with us. We have more news coming your way.